Kia ora everyone. Before I start, I usually like to find out who's in my audience, so I have a couple of questions for everyone here. Who here is doing Scrum mostly at team level? So that's about as far as it's got in the organisation. Okay, cool, probably about 2/3. Who's got some joined up teams? So maybe we've got a release train or we've got some teams of teams and they're aligned and synchronised. Maybe still a bit waterfall around the edges with our reporting and our governance and our funding. Yep. And is there anyone here who is basically Agile end-to-end? So we've got the budgeting in an Agile fashion, we've got reporting, we've got governance, etc., as well as delivery. Anyone here yet? No? No hands up, just for the record. Great. Okay, so nice to know who's in the audience today. So let me introduce myself. Ko Suzanne Nottage. So my name's Suzanne Nottage. I try to use Agile a bit outside of the workplace as well. So in the workplace, obviously, I'm constrained by a few things like what other people will let me do. So away from work, I like to run free and see what it can do. So 2 weeks ago, I finished my Masters in Management. I wrote a thesis on how unplanned work impacts Scrum teams. So this is 10,000 words, so not 10,000 words, but this is a 10,000 word report being organised on sticky notes on my sliding doors at home. And I also try and use Agile in the sports field as well. So I've been doing triathlon for about 10 years. First 2 years were very waterfall. And over the last 8 years, I've been chipping away trying to introduce a more Agile mindset. So I've taken 4 hours off my Ironman time by applying Agile principles and gone from second to last in my age group to third in my age group this year. So just evidence that it's not just about, thank you. Not just about IT, it applies in other circumstances as well. And finally, if you do come to Melbourne, where I'm based, Tuesdays, 7:30 in the morning in Docklands, we have Agile Lean coffee. So it's the best way to start a Tuesday morning. We get about between 6 and 20 people just talking about all sorts of Agile stuff. So please do come and join us. We're on Meetup, so always welcome visitors from different places as well. Okay, so just a little bit about TABCORP, because we're not usually associated with things to do with Agile. So you may know that tomorrow is the busiest day in our year. So tomorrow the Melbourne Cup happens. I'm based in the Melbourne office, and I have chosen to be at Agile New Zealand over the Melbourne Cup, which was a very difficult decision, but I'd like to thank my team for letting me be here today. So just a few things about us. We're actually the biggest race day control in the world. So the team in my building controls 127,000 races per year. That's up to 57 on a busy day. We own 3 TV channels, and in race day control, everything is basically still manual. So horses' names are still typed in manually. Buttons are pressed manually when races start, etc., etc. So it's a very manual process, and that's because part of it's still too hard to automate. So that also means that occasionally mistakes are made, and those are very costly for us because we have to give all our bets back. So it's not something we want to do often. So out of 127,000 races last year, our team made 14 errors, which means that they got it right 99.9889% of the time, which is pretty good. That team's run by a woman called Nicole Brasher, and over the last 5 years, TABCORP itself has put a lot of effort into increasing our diversity. So not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of cultural diversity. Lots of people from outside the industry, so cognitive diversity, people from manufacturing, etc. So that means our senior leadership team is 37% women now, and there are occasions when I go into meetings now and it's all female. As well, so or all non-Australians. Sometimes none of us were born in Australia. So a really diverse company these days. So moving on a bit to why we are here today. Over the past 3 years in Australia, which is as long as I've been in Australia for, up until February this year, I was consulting with lots of different companies before I went to TABCORP. So it was always a privilege to go into these industries and these organisations, and most people were just really open and honest with what their problems were. So it was a good opportunity to get a broad view of the landscape and where companies are at. And what I tended to find is that lots of companies are still doing what I call Swiss cheese agile. So we've got pockets of Scrum happening, but they're not necessarily joined up. and that means that we're not leveraging the benefits at portfolio level. And in that next layer up, so sometimes called the frozen middle, where we've got our program managers, our portfolio managers, some of our project managers, we're still planning and executing in a very project-centric way. Now, the problem with that is it's a bit like driving down the dark in a dark road with headlights on. So with our project view, we can see what's in front of us, but we're not so concerned about what's around us. And that means we don't necessarily have a good view of the system as a whole. It's a particular problem in service industries because, unlike manufacturing, we don't really have widgets building up around the factory, so our work is less visible. And it's also a problem in waterfall companies because our cycles are a lot longer, so it can take a lot longer for problems to surface. Okay. Just a word with my slides as well. In a couple of slides, they'll start to get they might be ones you want to take a photo of, so feel free to take a snap. If you can't get a good snap while it's up there, or if I move the photos too quick, come up to me afterwards and just take a photo of my slides. Okay, so they say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And once you throw light onto the problem or make the whole system visible, you can start to see what the real threats and risks are around you. And what it looked like in the dark might look very different in daylight. And one of the challenges I see is that a lot of companies still aren't making their system of work visible or their portfolios visible. So what we're going to do today is try and use some Kanban and some Agile practices to make our system visible so that we can start to see our work in progress and the flow of our work through the system. If we start doing this, it means we can organize our work better and organize our people better. And as I always like to say, we should try and make our people happier. So having happier people in our organization starts to lead to better results, as one of our keynotes said earlier today. Now, in terms of whether this is effective or not, in terms of my own experience in TABCORP, so I've been there for 9 months, over the last 12 months, by introducing some of the things that I'm talking about today, we've delivered 9 of our last 10 projects in our biggest portfolio in a row on time. And it was the right project that didn't get delivered on time. 12 months ago, we weren't delivering 2 projects in a row on time. So that's a significant change in the past 12 months. Cool. Okay. This might not immediately seem to link to Agile, but there was a company I worked with a little while ago, and anytime any unplanned work came up, we referred to it as a squirrel, okay? This is not quite a squirrel for the animal experts in the room, but I couldn't find a good picture of a squirrel. But it demonstrates the same sort of principle here. So we've got something unplanned which is distracting us from what we are supposed to do. And the same sort of problems happen in organizations. Now, for those of you familiar with Kanban or making your work visible, that's fine, but most of us tend to only make our planned work visible or our project work visible. So how many teams here have other stuff, so non-project work, BAU, prod defects, all those sorts of things, and you don't give them equal visibility on your Kanban board? Yeah, a few nods there, okay. So we're going to see some of the ways around that today. So that's one of the big problems I see both at team level and also exacerbated up at portfolio level as well. Now, with teams I've worked with and teams I interviewed as part of my Masters in Management, up to 40% of their capacity can be taken up with unplanned work. And when that's not made visible and given equal space on the Kanban board, that starts to cause problems in terms of impeding our flow, impeding the decisions we make, and impeding the delivery of the work of our people. The other thing with unplanned work is often it can take twice as long as planned work because it's much more vague. So it tends to come in at the last minute. It's more poorly understood. We use the word urgent to try and get it in. Urgent can mean all sorts of things in different companies, et cetera, et cetera. So it often doesn't come in with the same rigor as our planned work. So the first thing we're going to do, starting with the next slide, which is one you might want to take a photo of, is we want to build a wall. And it's really funny because there's a certain politician who has really helped me in the last year. And it took me a little while to figure this out. So other people started talking to me about build a wall. And I was like, it's got a real ring to it. I swear that I've heard this somewhere before. So yeah, a little bit of a shout out. I was never expecting to do a shout out to President Trump, but he has helped in terms of inspiring walls to be built in a good way in the organisations that I worked in. Incidentally, I spent a Friday evening several months ago measuring and counting all the walls before we moved sites to a new building. And in the building we were in, we had 50 walls which measured 130 metres of wallage, just for the people in our building. So a significant amount of wall space being used. The other thing about building a wall, and this is one mistake I see in companies, is we need to make the wall living. So it actually has to be used. And I know that sounds like common sense, but I've worked in a bank before where they took the wall building very seriously. So they came up with the idea of the wall, they got the printers involved, they spent a lot of money getting things properly printed, but it was never actually used. So we actually had a wall gathering dust, which was the opposite of helpful for trying to roll out Agile in the company. So as we'll see on the next slide, it doesn't have to be fancy at all. Just start simple and somewhere visible. All my slides have been anonymized here, so anytime you see anytime you see anything blanked out, it's just hiding a bit of commercially sensitive information here. So just to give you a scale of this wall is about probably 5 or 7 metres long. It's representing a whole portfolio. There's about 350 people's worth of work in here. How many people here have a wall at portfolio level in their company at the moment? Okay, so roughly, probably just under 10% of the people here. So this is in a really busy corridor where people are walking past all the time. And this is our main column here. This is our in-progress column. We've got work coming up here on the left, so this is planned stuff. This is a current increment, so several sprints worth of work. And this is regulatory and other things that need to be passed off. So the Scrum teams are working in here. We'll talk about this column most. Also got some, anyone guess what the red cards are for? Oh, close, risks. So red for risks or prod defects. And yes, we have a colour for unplanned work as well. So the unplanned work here is blue cards. So these are all at epic level, and this is unplanned work that we weren't expecting to do. So there's roughly 50 cards on the wall here, and 8 of them are unplanned, which doesn't sound like much until you put it in percentage terms and you work out that it's just under 20%. And that is quite a bit. So these were things that we weren't expecting to do. So there's a few things we need to know about this wall. So firstly, it's a wall. Secondly, it's living. So every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, this wall is used by about 30 people. So people from each of the horizontal work streams coming together. And there's 3 questions, surprise, surprise, 3 questions that we're asking. Slightly different to our normal stand-up questions, but it's basically what's changed on here since last week that other work streams need to know about. Okay, so maybe some unplanned work's come up. Maybe there's a new dependency, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is, what's moving to done this week that other teams need to know about? So we have some of our downstream teams here as well. They need to know what's coming down to them. And thirdly, what help do I need from other teams? So I've seen a lot more helpful behaviour, relationships built, all those sorts of things by doing this. This has been running for over a year. The other things that we have got on here are, so this is all at epic size, this is all at epic level. We have got sizes here. So the other problem that I see on many, many walls at team and portfolio level and companies that I visited is they put cards up, but they don't size the cards. So that's a bit like having a whole bunch of notes in your wallet that don't have any numbers on them. So you don't know whether you've got $5 bills in there or $100 bills. So that means we don't have a good view without those numbers of how much work in progress that we've got. We also have, it's hard to see here, up the side here we've got a confidence level. So how confident is the team that they're going to deliver all their work on a scale of 1 to 5 in the increment that they've promised. So that's a really good flag for our portfolio manager to have a look and see what help other teams need as well. Cool. Oh, before we do this, there's one team we need to get on board as well. So it's a change management activity. We need to get our friends in facilities on board. Has anyone had trouble putting sticky notes or blue tack on walls with facilities? Yep, okay. So that's that. Once we've got our wall up, we've got visibility of our portfolio, and we've got visibility of how many cards are in progress, but we still can't see flow. So that's where these dots come in handy. It sounds really simple, and to start with, people let me run away with this and they don't think that it's really going to make an impact. But over time, this builds up an interesting picture about how much work we've actually got in the system. So on our portfolio wall, as I said before, we've got just over 50 cards in play with the Scrum teams at the moment. So there's still some work at the end of the Scrum process that needs to happen before the teams release that work. But this is just about our teams and their work in the Scrum teams. And every week, we need to add a dot to the cards up here to represent how much time they've been in progress for. This is just such a really simple and powerful thing to do. So even if you're just doing Scrum at team level, it's something I suggest that you do every day. So at Scrum level, every day that your story is on the wall, give it a dot. At Epic and portfolio level, every week that it's on the board, give it a dot. Okay? So we can very quickly see here that this card has been on the wall for 6 weeks. This card's been on the wall for 7 weeks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Record was 17, okay? So not a good record to have. You do get a bit of positive peer pressure in there as well, because no one wants to have the card with the most number of dots on it. And walking past 50 cards, all of a sudden when you can see the 3 or 4 with the most dots, that's where you know you need to focus your efforts. So how can we help our teams get these items across the line? What are they blocked by? Is this too big and do we need to break it down, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what it looks like at an individual card level. But what if we started to add all these dots up? What sort of picture would that give us about our portfolio? Apologies for the small numbers on this slide. You don't really need to see the numbers on there, just really the trends. So when we had a picture of our big 5-metre long wall, all those cards on there had dots on them representing how long they'd been on the wall. So that's fine at an individual level, but it was still a bit hard to see how much work in progress each work stream had. So these work streams are teams of teams that are delivering streams of value. Once we start to quantify it, we can see some really interesting things here. So I blanked out the names of the work streams, but there's about 12 there. And you can see I've got two columns per work stream. So one was in June and one was about a month later. So just to look at how much it changed over time. And what we can see there, even if we're not mathematicians, is we can see a few of our work streams have a lot of work in progress. So 2 in particular have 50% of the work in progress. And in total, in our in-progress column, so our Scrum teams, we have 313 weeks of work in progress. And for the mathematicians out there, 313 weeks is 6 years. So our biggest portfolio has 6 years of work in progress in it. Now, I don't know what the right answer is for work in progress, but it's not 6 years. So that sounds to me like a culture that likes to start work more than it likes to finish work. A few other things we can start to see, and this is all just from doing the dots, is we can start to see how old our cards are. So how long have our epics been in progress for? Now, at team level, stories were flying through and getting done, but we know that it's epics rather than stories that deliver value to our customers. So what we found is that for a quarter of our cards, they were taking more than 9 weeks. And this is just to get through the Scrum part of the process. This isn't getting through the final testing, the regulatory part of the process, et cetera, et cetera. This is just our cycle time through the Scrum teams. So this led to some really interesting conversations about focusing on finishing rather than focusing on starting, and can we reduce our work in progress. This is done in Excel, so far we haven't spent any money on tools whatsoever. We've just got a bunch of index cards from Warehouse Stationery, and we've got Excel, our old friend here, to start having some powerful conversations. This also helped with the business. So our business, like many businesses, likes to push work into us. And once we started to quantify this and to show how much work in progress we had, how long things were taking to get through the system, they started to get on board about why they shouldn't push work through the system and why we should start to focus on pulling work through the system. So pull it through to done and then add more in. Don't just keep pushing more work in or we'll slow down the system even more. So this slide's fine if we're looking at an individual point in time, but we still can't see progress over time. And a few of the Agile tools, so if you're using CA Agile Central or if you're using Jira Portfolio, etc., you can start to get this picture over time. So if you haven't seen one of these before, and this is one slide that I am repeating from last year because it's such a good slide. If you haven't seen this cumulative flow diagram before, the keyword is flow. So this is showing work flowing through the system. And this is a real textbook one. So this is a real chart from a company I worked with in the States. And as I say, it's absolutely textbook here. So what we're seeing here is work flowing through the system. So this nice dark blue line is done work. So you can see done is piling up nicely. The flat spots are weekends, so we can also see the teams aren't working at the weekends, which is good. It should be flat at the weekends. The yellow line here is work in progress. This looks really healthy to me. So not only is it nice and narrow, showing we don't have too much work in progress, we've also avoided a divergence. So often teams like to start more than they finish, and that whip line diverges over time. But this has stayed nice and focused, which is really good. I suspect the teams had some work in progress limits on their scrum boards. And even our backlog here, we can see that more got added into the backlog during the release, but we were basically on track to deliver almost all of it. And remember, this is prioritized, so we're delivering the highest value stories first. Okay, so hats off to the teams. The teams have done really well here. But there's a really big problem. Even if you haven't seen one of these charts before, you'll notice that the one on the right is really different to the one on the left. Now, the problem is that these charts are both for the same company, and they're both for the same period of time, and it's the same portfolio. So how can that be when they're so different? Well, this chart here is at story level, the teams, mature Scrum teams who have sprinted together for months and months and months. And this is program and portfolio level, and they're not so experienced at working in Agile ways. So the problem is that these guys are delivering stories, but stories don't deliver value to customers. It's epics that deliver, features and epics that deliver value to our customers. And this chart on the right is the features being delivered rather than the stories. So what we're seeing here is, understandably, it takes a bit longer to get features and epics finished, but this is our work in progress, and you can see it looks very different to the one on the left here. So on the right here, we've got that divergence as managers are trying to push more work into the team, so we've got more and more work in progress. And what's the awkward conversation that's happening here about 3/4 of the way through the release? Yeah, what are we going to throw out of the backlog? What doesn't need to be delivered by release date? So all of a sudden, with a few weeks to go, we're having those awkward conversations. What can we not start? What can we de-scope? And what can we finish before the end of the release here? So over the past few slides, what we've been able to see is we've got our view of portfolio in our corridor, on our wall in our office. We've got that individual information on our cards, which is able to give us a point in time look at our work in progress and our flow. And then we've got our flow over time here. So seeing this, we showed this to the teams. So this was 500 people in 7 release trains working together to deliver a big health insurance product. And once we showed them this information at the end of the release, which was 6 months before go live, the next increment they agreed to focus on finishing features. So that was the one takeaway that they got out of that. So this is all fine. This is visualizing work in progress and flow in progress and all that sort of thing at portfolio level. But can we do this before we start working? Now, can I ask another question of the audience? Who's heard of something like big room planning or program increment planning, etc.? Cool. Okay, so probably 30, 40%. Who's been to one? Oh, awesome. Okay, so probably about 25, 30%.
So the next slide represents, I've covered all these again, they're just here if you want the slides afterwards. So again, oops, sorry, wrong slide. One more slide before the big room planning one. So again, if you're starting to use your tools at scale, you can get some really good information out of it to start planning the right amount of work for teams. Because one thing we're really good at doing is trying to push too much work on our teams. And one of the founding principles of Agile is all about sustainable pace and respecting people. And there's a really high cost of trying to push too much work onto our people in terms of churn, overhead, hiring new people, et cetera, et cetera. So for anyone who's starting to use tools like this is Jira Portfolio Jira, what we can start to do is put in the capacity of our team. We've got velocity information, which is based on real recent performance, and we can start to drop in our upcoming work here. So you can see that if you try and drop too much work into the teams, it's going to turn red. So that indicates straight away that we've got a problem. We're trying to push too much work into our teams. And before we even start working on that sprint or that increment, we can have conversations about right-sizing it. So can we remove that work and give it to another team? Can we make the feature smaller, et cetera, so that we're not pushing too much work onto our people. Okay, so just before, I asked a question about big room planning, and this is what it looks like in real life. So again, this is about how we make our portfolio visible and our work visible before we actually start it. So in my opinion, big room planning is probably the most important foundation to doing scaled Agile. In my opinion, you can't really do scaled Agile without big room planning. So I've been part of these events in the UK, the States, and Australia. Touch wood, none of them have gone badly yet. They've all gone really well, and companies have kept on doing them after I've been involved with them. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a really different way of planning the medium-term view of the work. So one of the challenges we have with traditional Scrum, is that we tend to talk about 2-week horizons. And when we've got lots of teams, and we've got long-term projects, we can start to apply some of the same principles on a bigger level. And one of these ways is with big room planning. So today I'm going to talk about a slight tweak to big room planning that I've seen one company do, which might be a bridge for people who haven't tried it here yet. So the basic format is a bit like sprint planning. We get together the people who are doing the work from the business and also the IT side of things. So this may be business sponsors, PMO, architects, security, developers, testers, program managers, project managers. Have I missed anyone out so far? All the upstream, downstream, and the people doing the work. Anyone with skin in the game over the next increment. So an increment is between about 4 and 6 sprints long, so between 8 and 12 weeks long. And what we're doing is we're collaborating over usually 2 days, but today I'm going to suggest a slight variance. And the outcome of this collaboration is by the end of the workshop, we've got the next 8 to 12 weeks of work planned and sequenced and schedules. We've got our risks made visible, we've got our dependencies, et cetera, and we've also had a confidence vote amongst the teams. So one of the challenges I've had over the past few years is getting senior stakeholders to trust me enough to give them all of their people for 2 days. So that's 2 days out of the office, away from doing work, et cetera, et cetera. It's a significantly different way of working. And so one thing I've done this year, both with a company I work with and also with a charity that I work with, is saying, well, instead of giving me your people for 2 days and to plan at a fairly detailed level, why don't we start off with 1 day for a shorter time period and at a higher level, and see whether we can get enough benefit there to make a significant difference in your performance. And so far, it's worked reasonably well. So I would love to have everyone together for 2 days, but there's a point where I am, and there's a point where the company is, and at the moment, we've met in the middle. So this is an event which is basically a big room planning LITE. So we've got almost everyone. So we've got every role represented, multiple people from every role represented. We're together for a day. It's the same sort of planning, just at a little bit of a higher level. And by the end of the day, we've got our next 8 weeks worth of work planned and sequenced, and confidence votes on how we think we're going to do. So in terms of this picture here, you might be wondering what these people are standing around doing. This is at the end of the day.
So just to walk you through, every team can see what every other team has planned. So we've got epics planned up here, we've got risks, etc. Every team has given a quick summary of what they're planning to do over the next 8 weeks. And we've got a number from 1 to 5 around the room. So we get people to physically stand up and walk to the number between 1 and 5 with how confident they are. So 5 means you're wildly happy with the plan, 4 reasonably happy, 3 happy enough to go along with it, no serious reservations. 2 means you want to call out a few concerns you have, and 1 means you're really unhappy. So this means we're getting the people who are organising the work to actually stand up and talk about their confidence. So you might think, and I've had this before, who's going to stand up against their colleagues and say, oh, I'm not happy with this plan? So we've got general managers in the room, senior product owners, et cetera, et cetera. So just to prove it does happen, in this particular group, we had about 60 people in the room, and about 10 people weren't happy with the plan. They said, look, we've been together for a day, we've planned and sequenced our work, but we actually don't think it's going to be achievable. And most of them had the same concerns, which is about resourcing. And so one of the great things about people being in the same room together for the whole day is we had general managers and people senior enough to make decisions on the spot so that some of those issues could get resolved before the teams actually went back and started sprinting. So if you compare that to a traditional way of working, how many emails and how much time and how many meetings would it have taken to get the same decisions as we got in one day? So it's certainly not perfect, but it has proved a much better way of working than the previous ways of working. And just a few stats from previous ones that I've run before. So in terms of a small big room planning, which might have about 60 people, I've counted 18 conversations at once happening at a time. For the number geeks out there, that was 300,000 words that was exchanged by the teams, and I'm being a little bit conservative there, over the course of the one day. So just think how long it would have taken normally for that amount of dialogue about the next 8 weeks of work. At the big one I mentioned before, where we had 500 people in release trains, over the course of 2 days, they made roughly 20,000 decisions on the next 12 weeks of work that they were delivering. So again, think about how long that would have taken in a normal way of working. And one of the great things is we've got two-way dialogue. So our business people are speaking directly to our techies, our developers, our project managers, et cetera, et cetera. So we're building relationships, improving collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. This is a photo of cards that were delivered. So at the end of an increment, the general manager he'd been collecting all the done cards, which I didn't know about. Turns out there were 91 cards, which it doesn't mean much when you don't know what the size of them were, but there were 91 cards delivered in about 8 weeks in this particular increment for this organisation. So the key thing for this was it was significantly more than any other 8-week period that the company had delivered. And the general manager was willing to stand up on stage and congratulate the teams because of the step change that he had seen in the performance of the teams by working in a scaled agile way. So making the portfolio visible, tracking the flow, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the reasons that it was significantly more productive was because there were fewer disruptions. So by making the work visible in real time, by having those weekly stand-ups at portfolio level, by doing the big room planning, unplanned work dropped by, I'm guessing, about 50%. Now, it's only a guess, but about 12 months before, the organisation's priorities used to change on a weekly basis. And that was very disruptive to the teams, obviously, because the business would change its mind frequently about what was important this week, what's important next week, et cetera, et cetera. So speaking to the portfolio manager afterwards, I said, what's the biggest change that you've seen in terms of your own workload? And he said, look, I've got a lot fewer meetings in my diary and a lot fewer emails in my inbox now, because people are making fewer changes. There's a higher bar for making a change. People are more aware of the disruptive effect of changing the work that the teams are working on. And people can see that when the teams are left to work on planned work, they actually get through it quicker. So we change our minds less now in terms of what we want, and we let our teams finish what they're working on before we give them new work. So we're still with these increments that are between 8 and 12 weeks long. We're still able to change our minds every 8 weeks. But once we've made a decision there, we tend to run with it more than we did in the past. So I tried to really crystallize some of the benefits here on my slides. Again, these are all available afterwards, so you'll get a copy of all of these. But just so that if you're going back and having conversations with people in your organization, these are all benefits that I've experienced from working with companies who are starting to make their WIP and their flow more visible at portfolio level. In terms of actions that you can take going forward, I like to make my talks really practical. So again, the actions that I come up with, hopefully you don't need senior stakeholder support, you don't need to go and buy a tool or do anything radically different. They're things that you can start to do after you get back to your workplace after the conference. So I came up with 4 things that I think most people here could go away and do. So the first is build a wall. Now, it might not be the wall that you want, it might be just a starting point. So a collection of like minds, and a sphere that's big enough to start to make change happen, but not too big to scare off people. And as I've said up there, it's a change management activity, so you might need to involve a few other people as well. So make friends with your facilities team, try and explain why it's more important than a coat of paint on the wall. So the portfolio I showed before had about $20 million worth of work on it. I'm not sure what a coat of paint costs, but it's definitely a lot less than $20 million. Again, try and quantify the work in progress and the flow. So even if it's just starting with dots, as simple as it sounds, it's a really powerful way of starting to have conversations about how much work is in progress. Thirdly, now this comes with a giant asterisk at the end of it. So when I say start big room planning, this is the one part where I say, please do it with a responsible adult, okay? Don't necessarily just run off and try this at home. Now, the reason I say that is because it's a very particular type of workshop. So I know some people go along and watch other people's. I think that's a great idea if you've got access to that, etc. It's the one thing where I say use a consultant who's done it before. Now, when I used to say that, I was a consultant, so I was selling my own wares. I'm not a consultant anymore, but it's still the one thing that I say, look, hire someone and actually spend the money on it. I know Kiwis and Aussies don't spend money the same way as Aussies and British companies do, but this is one point where it's worth the investment. And fourthly, weekly portfolio stand-ups. So I worked in several companies now where they started to do this. So sometimes the portfolio stand-up is held near the kitchen, so everyone's walking past. The more visible it is, the better it is as well. So those are the 4 actions that I think are good for people who are here today who can actually go back and start doing these without significant investment. It wouldn't be an Agile talk without some suggested reading at the end. So this is a book that was recommended a little while ago, and it touches on a lot of things we've talked about. So has anyone heard of this book before, The Lean Machine? Yeah, have you read it? Yeah. So it's not the first book I would recommend to someone who's just started in their Agile journey. It goes from being very high level to very detailed to very high level to very detailed, etc. So at times you feel like you're getting a bit of altitude sickness because the author likes to dip down and then back up again. So I probably would have edited it slightly differently, but it's a really good example and it's not IT. So again, there's nothing, Harley-Davidson's probably at the opposite end to banks and insurance companies. So it just proves that some of their talk in terms of product innovation, lean thinking, agile mindset, short development loops, all those sorts of things, it's all covered in there. Has anyone read The Machine That Changed the World? One nod, yep. It's 25 years old. I read it last year and it's as current now about the car industry as it was 25 years ago. And a lot of predictions they made 25 years ago have come true. So again, great insight into lean thinking and the difference in mindset between American manufacturers, Japanese manufacturers, and European manufacturers as well. It's a fairly meaty book. You know that feeling when you've just finished Christmas dinner and you're going, I don't know how I ate so much. It was really good, but I need to process it. So it's a bit like that. You get it and it's a really thin book, and then you realize how small the font is. You're like, they tricked me. And finally, if you would like a bit of, if your brain would like a bit of a challenge, this is a book I read earlier this year. So I have read Bounce before, and I recommended it at last year's conference. Someone at work recommended this book, and it really challenges your thinking and talks about cognitive dissonance. So what sort of beliefs are you holding on to that really aren't helpful? And what do you think is truth that really isn't truth? So it compares a lot of industries. So aviation, which has a very open culture about accidents, very blame-free culture in terms of preventing crashes, etc., compared to medicine and law, which treat accidents and incidents very differently. So more of a closed book approach. So it's quite confronting. It's one of those books you put it down and go to work, but it's still in your head all day. Yeah, one of the most challenging books I've read this year in terms of getting me to change my own mindset. Okay, so we've got 40 seconds left on the clock. Didn't we do well? So with that, can I just tell a quick story since I've got 40 seconds? It's about the power of change and how a few conversations, you never know the impact of them coming down the track. So I got introduced to Agile in London by someone who's actually here today, who lives in Wellington today. So his name's Mark Drysdale, and we've known each other for about 10 years. And every now and again, he reminds me how waterfall I was in my little PMO job when he met me. And he was one of the people who really changed my mind and opened my mind. And I never thought that 10 years later we'd both be at Agile New Zealand here today. And in our time together at Bupa in the UK, one of the things I wanted to really do to get the Agile word out there was to get some training out there. So I have a training background. Now I needed some help to do that, and I needed our trainers on board. And our trainers had never heard of Agile before. So I went to them and explained it, and they said, doesn't sound like it just applies to IT. It sounds like we could use this as well. And so not only did they take the concept, they developed training that went on to win awards in the UK for its innovational approach to training. They went on to train 400 people in our company. And one of those women actually picked up Agile, and when she moved to New Zealand last year, she actually got a job with a surety and is just to my right here. So it's funny how, it's just funny how small a world is and how a few conversations you have changing people's minds can all of a sudden 10 years later have big impacts on people around you. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening today. One thing I do like to do is to do a quick fist of 5 to see how much this talk was relevant to you. So if you enjoyed the talk and you're going to take some things back and maybe lead to some further discussions and it's been really useful use of your time, then a 5. If this was a waste of your time and you wish Jacob's talk had gone ahead and you would have rather spent it with him, and it was, not that useful, then a 1. And if it was somewhere in between, then somewhere in between. So can I just get a bit of feedback on how you found the talk today? Cool. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. I'll just hand back to